don't try and boil the whole ocean at once. There's so many sites and businesses that say, okay, we're going to launch. We need like a full menu of customer stories, full menu of recorded events and testimonials. This is a marathon, right? And I know your investors are going to be rewarding you for getting customers quickly. But, based on what you've learned from the advocates that you've decided or the enthusiasts, is start simple.
Alrighty, folks, welcome to the State of Customer Storytelling podcast. I'm your host, Sam Shepler from Testimonial Hero. This is the show that is all about helping you as a customer marketer, a B2B marketing leader, understand the most current practices and strategies related to all things customer marketing and customer storytelling. The State of Customer Storytelling podcast is brought to you by Testimonial Hero. Testimonial Hero helps over 300 B2B software companies easily create stunning video testimonials that close deals faster. You can view examples and find out more at testimonialhero.com. Today on the show, we have Scott K. Wilder, formerly Global Head of Customer Engagement and Community at HubSpot. Scott currently advises early stage companies on customer advocacy and community. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sam. Every time I think about your name, I think of Sam Shepard. So sorry about that. But anyway, Sam, it's great to be here. Thank you.
It's funny. That's like the most common typo that I get because I think people it's just like the way your brain works, you just think that. So, I totally agree. And, it could be worse, right? But yeah, good to have you here. And just to kind of kick things off, why do customer stories, matter so much, particularly, today in B2B? Why does customer storytelling and, customer stories matter?
So, you think about some of the data I've seen recently is, 76% of purchases that are made, the buyer or the decision maker really relies on 2 or 3 advocates or people they know to influence their decision. And when they're reaching out to those folks, if somebody's reaching out to me for advice about a product, I'm probably going to tell them, yeah, it's great, but I'm also going to tell them a story about how I use it. So stories are just a big part of who we are. And so I think from the customer perspective, it definitely enables them to feel more comfortable with their engagement, their purchase, etc. Right? It gives them that sense of comfort and trust. From the company side, it really humanizes the whole experience. It humanizes the brand. And in these customer stories, as well as you collect them, there's a tremendous amount of insights that can come out, right? A lot of us go through the process of just capturing these stories, but if you listen to the language people use, right, tremendous insights in terms of how they talk about the product. If I can go off on a tangent for a second, many years ago, I worked on a device by Sony that was an internet device, and they were insistent on having the device be on night tables, so people could really see the internet or see the time from there. And so I went out and interviewed customers, and it was really funny. And listening to the stories, all these women started talking about how they would prefer to use the device in the kitchen for recipes. And then they had this certain way they talked about it as well, right? So we had Sony, this corporation, that said, look, we're going to go down this path for whatever reason. But then it was the stories that I heard from the audiences that we wanted to reach. And those were the ones that really influenced not only how we market the product, but also other things.
I want to click in on that humanizing the brand, because that's such a good way to put it. And I think, a lot of people, it's very current, right? A lot of marketers, we're all thinking, we need to further humanize, our brand. And, sometimes we say it and then we move on and, maybe it doesn't happen. But I'd be curious, what does that, humanizing the brand, mean to you?
Yeah, for me, it's really understanding how the customer talks about your product. What is the context they use your product in? What are the jobs or tasks they're trying to accomplish? When I was at Intuit, we really tried to understand how the customer uses the product in their environment. And we didn't just look at, okay, there's a screen and they're on QuickBooks. We wanted to see what was around their computer, what kind of business problems they were trying to solve. We also asked them to talk about the product and talk about what it means to them, how they feel about it, whatever. So in a nutshell, it's understanding the words and phrases people use and trying to incorporate that in your marketing programs. It's understanding the context that people use it, right? It's not just a credit card in your wallet. There's this whole thing that people use. I call a wallet your power pack, right? So it's like there's more in your wallet. So understanding the context of it. And then humanizing it. Another thing is like bringing those people to life, whether it's through images, whether it's through video, etc.
And, throughout your career, you mentioned Intuit, and, I know you've also been at, so many other, really market leading companies, Adobe, Marketo, Google, Udacity, and more. How have you seen customer advocacy sort of evolve over, the course of your career?
Yeah. So also, I think that early in my career, which I didn't even put it on my LinkedIn profile, I worked at American Express, where I think credit card companies, financial institutions, airlines, they put a lot of energy into loyalty programs. And so for me, that's partially the beginning of a lot of this stuff and thinking about like how you build out a loyalty program. And I can go into some of the ways they were thinking about it. But as I moved in more into the B2B tech world and worked along Highway 101 in San Francisco, I found that a lot of these companies several years ago had these different initiatives. So for example, one group would be working on customer stories. Another would be working on a reference program. Another would be working on testimonials. What I see customer advocacy doing is really tying all that together, taking a holistic approach to these programs. So there's consistency in the programs. So not everybody's reaching out to the same customer asking for the information, et cetera. And it's an exciting time because customer advocacy is also fueling what I would call the new customer-led growth movement as well, right? So you have customer-led growth, you have advocacy as the fuel that's driving it. And under advocacy, there are these pillars of different types of engagement, stories, testimonials, reviews, et cetera.
And tell me more about, customer-led growth, because that's definitely, something I've been hearing, more often. How do you think about, the customer-led growth, and what is the customer-led growth movement?
Well, I think when we want to buy a product, we're relying on our peers. We're relying on, other individuals, sometimes peers, sometimes we'll call them experts, influencers, right? And so those people who are going to recommend your product or give you advice about it, hopefully they're using the product, right? And I'm not going to recommend a product I don't know about. So I'm a customer and I'm going to basically be giving recommendations. And so as a customer, I'm driving I'm kicking off that whole process, that whole journey that an individual will go on with a company.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And you mentioned also the loyalty programs. I do want to touch on that as well. What do you think B2B marketers, what do you think we can learn from, maybe the best practices or the philosophies that drive these, very effective consumer loyalty programs?
Yeah. I mean, they're definitely looking at, when I worked at American Express, they were definitely thinking about the journey that an individual is going to interact with your product, with your company, not your product. I think that's a really important thing, especially for larger companies that have multiple products. When I got to American Express, they basically treated Joe Smith as a green card holder, a gold card holder, and a platinum card or corporate card holder, right? That person had 4 cards in his portfolio and they had 4 different marketing programs. The insight, and again, this was a long time ago, was that it's one customer. And so basically they kicked off the initiative to try and make sure that all their programs are talking to that customer based on their tenure versus based on the product they have. And I think that one thing we can learn is interacting with customers based on their tenure, based on their touch points, versus saying, I have product A and therefore I'm going to talk to you all about product A.
Yeah.
The other thing too is, these companies and financial institutions and credit cards is they looked at the whole ecosystem of how that customer is going to interact with you and other brands that are related. So going back to the American Express example, American Express would market to you not just for as a American Express customer, but they'd say, well, wait a minute, you go on Delta Airlines, you also go on American Airlines. And so they'd figure out what those are other behaviors you have. And again, they would market to you, incorporating all of them into their communications because they had an incredible way of tracking how you use your card. And so how does that translate in the B2B world? If I'm at a Marketo, for example, this is kind of before I went to Adobe, we knew that you were a customer of Marketo, but we also knew what other products in the Marketo ecosystem or in the LaunchPoint partner program that you use. And I think that's really important. If we talk about an advocacy program, it'd be great if we can partner with other companies and say that, Sam is a customer of Adobe, but Sam is also using Behance, which is Adobe product, and other things that, Adobe's associated with. Adobe's getting into NFTs now, all those things. And so all of a sudden, it helps you because, Sam, you're not going to be bombarded by all these different people. You're going to have one holistic message. Now, for smaller companies, the way instead of thinking about all these business partnerships, if you don't have them, think about how you tie together all these different touch points. Again, Sam is the customer, but I don't want the support team to reach out to him and then the acquisition team reach out to him. And so as you think about advocacy, or customer engagement, to think about it holistically in terms of your communications.
Such a good point. And speaking of smaller companies and, maybe, startups who are growing quickly, but they're not, enterprise companies yet, what other principles or, perspective would you offer for these early stage companies who want to, execute better on their customer advocacy?
Yeah, I think the first one is trying to identify, the first one is your business objectives and what you're trying to accomplish. But after that is, a lot of these companies are wrestling with, how do I identify the enthusiasts or the advocates? And that's where you can, look at people. I'll take a company called the Ramp, right? I use them, and they do expense management. But you go on Twitter and you see what people are writing about the Ramp, right? So it's a great opportunity for that company to reach out to those individuals on Twitter and see if they want to be part of the program. A second tactic for identifying them is going into G2 and seeing who's writing reviews about you. A third tactic is, who's contacting you and asking questions either in your chat or your call center. So that's helping you identify who these enthusiasts are. And the next thing is to partner with them and co-design, something that Intuit is really into, co-design the program. So what I mean by that is figure out, should you start with a customer story? Should you start with an advocacy point system? These individuals are going to help guide you of what's influenced them when they used your product. They're also going to help you with the language. And I'm really big on how we talk to customers and using their language, not our language, with them. So that's just three ways. And I think the last thing is, don't try and boil the whole ocean at once. There's so many sites and businesses that say, okay, we're going to launch. We need a full menu of customer stories, full menu of recorded events and testimonials. This is a marathon. Right. And I know your investors are going to be rewarding you for getting customers quickly. But, based on what you've learned from the advocates that you've decided or the enthusiasts, is start simple. Maybe you start with customer stories. I'm a big fan of what you're trying to do with videos, and videos are really easy to do. Depending on, how strict you want to be about the look and feel of it, you could identify 10 customers, ask them to get their phones out, ask them to ask 3 or 4 questions, or ask them to answer 3 or 4 questions, right? And then you can have 10 videos or 30 videos right away.
I love that phrase, and it's just co-designing. That's such a powerful way to put it. And that's something that we, could improve on a little bit. So I want to kind of, take this to opportunity to kind of push on that and learn a few more things from you here. If I'm going to actually, co-design, our advocacy program, is it basically as simple as, going to the customer and instead of, just asking, hey, can you do X, Y, Z? It's is it just so here's our kind of menu of things that we had in mind. We're open to, whatever, would be valuable to you. And it's like, what would you want to do first? Because like, I guess from my perspective, I'm always, I can sometimes am, conscious of like, all right, well, like we want to get them to do, say, like a video testimonial eventually. So maybe we ask for that sooner, but like, if we ask them for a G2 review, maybe we have to wait, 2 months to ask them for the video testimonial. Ultimately, the real answer is, you have to do what's best for the customer. And so I guess the question is like, yeah, tell me more like the specifics, like how can I do a better job co-designing my advocacy program?
Yeah. There's a discipline called ethnography, which is kind of an anthropological approach to some of this. And I don't want to sound like I'm in the faculty lounge throwing out these terms. But so I think some of the things to do is first, when you identify these individuals, is understand how they learn about your products or about similar products. Asking them where they go, right? They might go to LinkedIn or they might go to Twitter. They might go to both. The second thing is understanding when they go to your site or they interact with your product, like what resonates with them the most, right? So you're going to have to ask a lot of questions around like the 5 whys. Well, if they say your site resonates the most, well, why? And they might say, well, because there's a lot of information. Well, why? And eventually you'll get to, whether it's, again, is it a story? Is it a text-based story or a video-based story? It's also good to ask them what other companies are doing well. And then I'm going to go back and talk about like really listen to how they talk about your product. So you want to ask those questions. To be honest, I wouldn't lead with a menu. That's what we do with all our surveys. I would use that as kind of like the second step because at first you want to make sure what's spontaneous, what's top of mind for them, what's going to come out for them. Sometimes one thing I've learned in my previous job was that depending on how you structure the survey and depending on where the survey is offered, you can influence their decisions. So what do I mean by that? If I give the same survey off our knowledge base website and off our community, and then I ask the question, which one influences you more? I can tell you that the people who are at the knowledge base page are going to say the knowledge base and the people who are at the community, right? So it's really important to kind of think about that as well. And you might want to try different ways. Another thing which doesn't directly answer your question, but I get at as well as in these stories is you want to understand how your customers, how these people that you're talking to are relatable for your customers. There's a really good book called Putting Stories to Work. And I really recommend it for everybody. And they make a point about how our B2B approach to customer stories is a little broken. And they kind of have a formulaic approach of saying like, okay, so in these stories, you're meeting Bob. And so it's really important to understand why Bob is like you, right? So even before you get to the problem that Bob is trying to solve, somehow when you're putting together these programs and you've collected all this information, try and figure out why Bob is like your customers so they can relate to them. And the next thing is Bob has an issue, right? And it could be a business problem. It could be whatever. And so it's important to flesh out why Bob's not feeling good about why he's not feeling good because he encountered this issue. And that's something you can pull out when you're doing these interviews or when people are doing their, video testimonials or whatever. And then Bob finds a solution and he's feeling better. So that's kind of it. And, what's interesting is, again, a little bit of a faculty lounge thing. If you look at how stories are put together, right? It's a little bit like that, in terms of, creating this common link between the reader and the storyteller in the beginning, right? So there's a whole kind of rhythm of this. So long-winded answer to your question here is I start with questions but open-ended questions about where they go, what language, how they listen to how they talk about the product, which websites they use, ask them who does it well, who doesn't do it well and why. And then you can, lead in with kind of, if you're not getting the answer to your questions, here's the menu.
That makes a ton of sense. And I think that's a super, actionable takeaway that, I know that's a change I can make today and hopefully for folks listening as well. Shifting to the mediums and the different, content types, how do you think about, the different mediums and formats of customer stories, specifically on the marketing side, not as much the research side, but like, the video, third-party review sites, and of course, classic, there's written case studies, and, maybe there's even more. I mean, arguably reference calls, even though they're not external, could possibly be included in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think of, customer stories or customer success stories. I mean, we're trying to, those are, most of the time on your own property, your own site. I tend to think of things as like your owned versus not owned platforms. And, at the end of the day, you want to show that person's success with your product. And a testimonial is kind of like a shorter version, quick tidbit of it, a quick snapshot. And then, the reviews, they tend to be on third-party sites like G2. And those are interesting because it's somewhat of a neutral ground. I think it is a neutral ground where they can, highlight the good, the bad, and some of the challenges of the product. I say somewhat neutral because it's really important that if you're paying or rewarding, people to write a review, that you acknowledge that someone acknowledges that, right up front. When I worked at Udacity, we actually had the person posting the review. We did a campaign, but in the review, we said, by the way, I've received a gift certificate for this. So being as transparent as possible. So again, customer stories and testimonials tend to be on your own platform, reviews on other platforms. And then, everybody who has Slack these days, if you look at the left-hand side, there's probably like 10 different Slack channels that you're part of. And so that's a non-owned property where, somebody can, talk about and praise your product. And so really thinking about like, how does that fit into the advocacy mix?
Yeah. And that's I think a perfect segue to talk more about communities. And I know that's something you're passionate about. Yeah. Tell me more, like, how do communities, how are communities and advocacy kind of blending together and overlapping these days?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when I was at HubSpot, we definitely integrated both of them and looked at the advocacy program as something that was hosted on the community. Christina, who did a great job running the program, she used to say, I'm running the program, but you're selling me real estate on your community platform. I think historically we've treated advocates and community champions as kind of like two separate things. And more companies are realizing that there's a big Venn diagram that overlapping these individuals. The folks who are your power users or all-stars or champions in your community who are answering most of the questions tend to be very similar to the folks who are advocating your product on non-owned properties and social media. And then also, I think historically communities, they've tried to they probably were farther along in the maturity model of hosting an experience or having user-generated content for different personas, like the partner versus the developer versus the admin or practitioner. And we'll see more and more of these advocacy programs as they evolve, break down their audience into these very similar segmentations. So you don't want to be talking to your developer here in community land and doing something similar in advocacy land. You want it all to be one holistic experience. And so a second trend will be like having one unified gamification or point system or badging system. There's a few companies that are doing that. Don't put me on the spot and ask me, but not many, right? We're still trying, they're still kind of treated differently, but I think that will change in the next year.
That's interesting. And so I guess, would it be fair to say that, like, historically speaking, a lot of what is kind of advocacy has been happening just more siloed, and then now that we kind of have this term customer advocacy, and that's now we actually have more and more companies have this specific role, customer advocacy manager, or customer, sometimes it's customer marketing, director of customer marketing. I guess, tell me a little bit more about that. Like, has simply just like clarifying it and like the language evolving, like, is that one of the things that's like driving this like renaissance? Because I know we've seen just like the marketing, the hiring for customer advocacy and customer marketers is like one of the fastest growing jobs right now.
Yeah, LinkedIn recently posted that it was number 3 on its list, number 3 in terms of like hot professions, customer marketing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of it is, being around the block for a few years and having some gray hairs. Is a lot of communities started in customer support, and customer support is not really thinking about advocacy. So that's one thing. And along those lines, since it's moved into marketing, marketing is thinking about advocacy. The second thing is, I do think companies are doing a better job working cross-functionally, right? And so when you're working cross-functionally, you can, if advocacy starts in customer marketing or starts in customer success, you can partner with, guide, educate, whatever word you want to use, other parts of the organization. Think about beta testers, for example, right? They were kind of buried in the product team. So as we work cross-functionally, in one company I worked with when I was consulting once, is we literally I had the product team in there, customer success, customer support. And I said, everybody go to the whiteboard and draw your own circles. Then draw the 3 names of your top customers. And there was overlap. Like you saw a few names appearing in all the circles. Now, I got lucky early on to be aware of this, because when I was at Intuit, they moved the community team to a different group every 6 months. It was something we worked out. So when I was with the product team, I said, wow, like the beta testers are really similar to the people answering questions. Or, in Google's case, that Google has this huge AdWords community of small agencies. And everybody who wants to promote AdWords or talk about AdWords is reaching out to these same small agencies. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of them, but they're all, looking at the top of the pyramid.
Absolutely. And earlier you gave some really good tips on, for folks who are just getting started in their advocacy journey. Start with aligning with the business problems and don't try to boil the ocean at once. It's absolutely a marathon, not a sprint. What other kind of tips or perspective could you share with someone who's like in the position where like they realize now, the importance of advocacy, and they're starting to kind of put their program and put their strategy in place?
Yeah, I would consider, depends on budget, but consider like investing in tools or platforms to track advocacy, because you don't want to find yourself, and I have found myself in these shoes, is with multiple Google Sheets trying to stitch all this behavior together, right? And it's just hard to keep track of all your advocates then. It's also hard to identify trends and patterns. So I think one key thing is, look at some of the options out there to track these programs. And that's like from a tracking and data perspective, but it also helps from an automation perspective in terms of like trigger programs. Take a page from, Marketo or HubSpot in terms of marketing automation, Gainsight in terms of its automation, and say like, is there a tool that can help me, the one person show, communicate with all these advocates? Even if you have only 100 advocates or you have 10 advocates, well, that's still a lot of people. You do want to get personal with these people. Hopefully nobody from HR is listening. You do want to get personal. And so, saying, hey, Sam, and then everything else is the same in the email is not personal. I think another thing too, which if you're a company hiring somebody, is hire somebody who's a member of the group or tribe of the advocates that you're trying to market to. What I mean by that is, I think you'll get there, wherever there is, faster if you have somebody who's already a member of that group. At Marketo, Liz, who was on the team with me, she was so close with our champions. This was a community use case, but community champions. But she was one of them, right? And so what she said, she had that credibility and that trust, and she was able to communicate with them. I love HR people, but I'm not an HR person. So you probably will not see me go, necessarily work for a company where I'm marketing to HR people every day. I would tell the company there's better people to do that. Another company I talked to just this morning, they're developing advocacy in the fintech space. And they asked me, how important is it somebody knows the product? It's important. They know the product. They know they know the industry, they're able to talk the language, and they are, a accountant, or they're like an accountant.
Yeah, I love that. It's such a good, there's no better way to be able to understand what's going to resonate than, if you have someone on your team that's like a part of that tribe. It's such a key point, but often overlooked. Wrapping up here with just a final question or two. You've seen the evolution of customer stories and customer advocacy really happen. I'm curious what you think about the future and how things are continuing to evolve. What do you think perhaps the future holds? If you're going to kind of get your proverbial crystal ball out.
So I think the stories will continue to evolve, and what I mean by that is, I think text-based is important, but we'll see more videos, more shorter videos. I think there'll be more like a narrative put together, an experience. I think there'll be more of focused on like the practitioner as much as the company, right? I think we're all in this right now trying to figure out like how we improve our craft, how we improve our career. And so I think in these stories about how I use a product, say how I use HubSpot or Marketo, that's going to be a key element in it. I think we'll see more video, as I talked about. I have this belief that can I end with a story?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, an architect in America designs a building, gets built, and that's it. In Japan, when an architect designs a building, they feel some responsibility for the building's well-being over time and how it looks. And I once hung out with a bunch of architects in Japan, and they took me on a field trip to look at a building that they had worked on, or they had initially designed 5 years earlier. And I asked them about it. I said, we go back every year just to see how the building, it portrays itself, or how it looks. And I think there's an opportunity for just to make customer stories a more evergreen experience. Definitely labor intensive, but we'll figure that out. And then also you can tie that to adding to the individual story over time of how they're using your product, right? So Sam, you might be using, Salesforce, but how you use it today and how you use it in 12 months is going to be completely different. It's going to evolve. And so I think video will make that easy to add to those stories. So I think that will become more like, when we design these programs, more like architects, Japanese architects, than just kind of a one and done, launch the story and see how it does and look at the metrics.
I love that. And I mean, that's such a, perfect and, beautiful example, and just the kind of the care and the intentionality and the attention to detail, that I think that example exemplifies is fantastic. Scott, this has been awesome. Where can folks who want to connect with you, where can they learn more about you or get in touch?
Yes, you can always find me on LinkedIn, Scott K. Wilder, or you can find me at scott@partnereconomy.com.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Scott.
Sam, thank you. It's great seeing you, Mr. Shepherd.
Alrighty, folks. That was a fantastic episode with Scott K. Wilder. Ton of really good takeaways on that. Some of the biggest ones for me personally were, this idea of the customer-led growth movement, and that advocacy is really the fuel for that. Also, the humanizing a brand and why and how that is so powerful. Learnings from Scott's days, at American Express, and, talking to the customer in a holistic way, based on their actual tenure, not just, the product or the products, and having much more holistic interactions. Touched on a lot of great stuff about how to get started with advocacy, particularly with smaller companies, and one of my favorite takeaways from this episode by far was this, phrase of co-designing, and the idea that you can and should co-design your advocacy program rather than sort of just, going top down on the customer and say, hey, here's our advocacy program, which is well-meaning, but take some time to think about and have a conversation and take a ethnographic approach to it and co-design it. But at the same time, realize that you don't have to, boil the ocean at once. It's a marathon, not a sprint. I could go on. Those are just some of my favorite takeaways from this episode. Definitely, give Scott a follow on LinkedIn. If you were listening, you have any other recommendations for guests, just shoot me an email. My email is sam@testimonialhero.com. And this has been The State of Customer Storytelling, and we'll see you in the next episode.